The plate hit the grass before I even understood what had happened to my face. Gregory's hand connected with my cheek so fast that for a second I genuinely thought a bird had flown into me, some strange collision I couldn't place. Then the sting bloomed, and the potato salad I'd been carrying was spread across the lawn, and the whole backyard had gone silent except for the propane hiss of the grill. "Watch where you're standing," Gregory said, shaking out his hand like the impact had cost him something. I hadn't been standing anywhere unusual. I'd turned to set the bowl on the folding table, and my elbow had brushed his arm. Nothing more than that, the kind of contact that happens a dozen times at any family gathering with 20 people crowded around 3 tables. My cheek was already warm and tightening by the time I got my breath back. Nobody moved. My cousins stood frozen with cups halfway to their mouths. An uncle looked down at the grill like it needed urgent attention. And then my sister Patricia walked over, not toward me but toward Gregory, and put her hand flat against his chest like she was the one comforting the injured party. "Apologize to him," she said. I stared at her, my palms still pressed to my face. "Patty, he hit me. You know how he gets when people crowd him. Just say sorry so we can move on." "No," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. Gregory laughed, short and satisfied, like my refusal had confirmed something he'd been saying about me for years. Patricia's expression hardened. She pointed toward the driveway. "Then you should probably go." I looked around that backyard, the string lights I'd hung that morning, the tablecloths I'd ironed, the 3 bags of ice I'd bought on my way over because Patricia said their budget was tight again this month, and I understood, in a single clear moment, that I was not going to spend one more minute defending myself to people who had already decided not to see what had happened. I walked to my car with my cheek burning and nobody following behind me. Halfway across the lawn, I heard Gregory mutter to someone near the cooler, "She's always so dramatic about everything." And a couple of people laughed, the kind of laugh that exists specifically to smooth an uncomfortable moment back into something bearable. What none of them knew, sitting there finishing their burgers while I drove away with a handprint rising on my face, was that within 4 days a locksmith and an attorney would be standing on their front porch with a stack of documents that would end the argument before it even had the chance to become one. My grandfather had seen this exact day coming years before it happened. Not the specific slap, not the specific excuse Gregory would use, but the pattern. And he'd made sure that if it ever surfaced, I wouldn't need anyone at that barbecue to stand up for me, because the paperwork already had. I need to go back, because none of what happened over the following week makes any sense without understanding who my grandfather was and what he'd quietly arranged 2 years before any of this. His name was Arthur Merrick, and he quietly raised me for large parts of my childhood while my mother worked long, exhausting double shifts at a hospital laundry facility 2 towns over. Patricia is 4 years older than me, and by the time I was old enough to really remember things, she had already mostly moved out of my grandfather's daily orbit, first for college, then for Gregory, then for a life that revolved almost entirely around whatever Gregory needed that week. I stayed close to my grandfather. I drove him to appointments. I managed his prescriptions after his heart surgery. I spent most Sunday afternoons at his kitchen table doing nothing in particular, just being present, which turned out to matter more than either of us realized at the time. Patricia used to tease me about it, lightly, the way sisters do. "Grandpa's favorite," she'd say, not unkindly, back when things between us were still easy. I never thought of it as a competition. I liked being there. He liked having me there. That was the whole arrangement, uncomplicated, until Gregory entered the picture and complicated everything he touched. Gregory had a way of making himself the center of gravity in any room he occupied, and my grandfather, who did not suffer performative people gladly, saw through it almost immediately. He never said much about it directly, not at first. He'd just get quiet during family dinners when Gregory held court, watching him with an expression I evalually learned to recognize as evaluation rather than enjoyment. The comments started small, the way they always do. "You still haven't found anyone, huh?" Gregory would say to me across the table, like my being single at 31 was a diagnosis rather than a fact. "Must be nice not having to answer to anybody." When I mentioned once that I'd taken on extra hours at the accounting firm where I worked, he said, without missing a beat, "Some people just don't know how to stop working long enough to have a life." Patricia would laugh along, or shrug, or say some version of, "That's just Gregory being Gregory." And over time, the family absorbed his comments the way you absorb weather. Unpleasant, occasionally, but not worth fighting. My grandfather noticed all of it. 2 years before he died, on one of our regular Sunday afternoons, he told me to sit down at the kitchen table because he wanted to talk about something that wasn't going to be a comfortable conversation. I remember one dinner in particular, maybe a year before that conversation, where I'd spent an entire weekend helping Patricia repaint her kitchen because she and Gregory couldn't afford to hire anyone. And at dinner that same week, Gregory told the table, with a straight face, that he'd finally gotten around to fixing up the kitchen himself. Patricia laughed along instead of correcting him. Nobody else at the table knew any different, so nobody questioned it. I sat there with paint still faintly visible under 2 of my fingernails and said nothing, because saying something would have meant making an issue out of a compliment that was never mine to begin with, and I'd already trained myself to believe that kind of thing wasn't worth the friction. My grandfather, sitting across from me, caught my eye for just a second. He didn't say anything either, not that night, but I found out later he remembered it, because he brought it up himself, unprompted, the day he told me about the house. "I'm leaving you the house," he said, no preamble, the way he said most things that mattered to him. I told him that didn't seem right, that Patricia had lived closer to it as a kid, that she and Gregory needed the space more than I did since they were renting a cramped apartment on the other side of town. He shook his head before I even finished. "I've thought about this for a long time," he said. "I'm not doing it because I love you more. I'm doing it because you've shown me, every single Sunday for 15 years, who you are when nobody's watching. And I've watched Gregory show me who he is plenty of times when he thought I wasn't paying attention. He told me he wanted to give Patricia and Gregory time in the house anyway, because he didn't want his decision to feel like punishment, and because he genuinely hoped Gregory would prove him wrong. So he had his attorney draft something more complicated than a simple deed transfer. The house would go to me outright, recorded and finalized while he was still alive, precisely so there would be no ambiguity or contested will after his death. But layered on top of that would be a formal occupancy agreement, allowing Patricia and Gregory to live in the house rent-free for a period of years, on the condition that they treat me, the legal owner, with basic decency. If that condition was ever violated through harassment, intimidation, or physical harm directed at me, the occupancy agreement would terminate immediately, and I would have the unrestricted right to reclaim the property. "I hope you never have to use it," he told me, sliding a folder across the table. "But I've watched that man's temper long enough to know I'd rather you have the option and never need it than need it and not have it." I signed what I needed to sign. His attorney, a careful, soft-spoken man named Nathaniel Cross, walked me through every page. I remember asking whether this was overkill, whether we were building a legal fortress around a family disagreement that might never happen. Nathaniel just looked at me and said, "Your grandfather has been very specific about what he's observed. I trust his judgment on this." My grandfather passed away 8 months later, quietly, in his sleep. The kind of ending that felt almost too gentle for a man who had spent his whole life being careful and deliberate about everything else. Patricia and Gregory moved into the house within a few weeks of the funeral, believing, as far as I could tell, that it had simply passed to Patricia the way most people assume these things work in families. I never corrected the assumption directly. It wasn't my job to announce ownership of a home nobody had questioned me about. I paid the property taxes quietly through the estate account Nathaniel had set up. I let them live their lives. I want to be honest about something. Part of me hoped Gregory would prove my grandfather wrong. I didn't want to be right about him. I didn't want to be the person holding a legal trigger over my own sister's marriage, waiting for an excuse to pull it. For 2 years I watched him make the same comments he'd always made. Watched Patricia laugh them off the same way she always had. And I told myself that words, however sharp, weren't the same as the thing the occupancy agreement was actually built to guard against. I let it slide because the alternative felt like declaring war on my own family preemptively, and I wasn't willing to do that over jokes, however unkind. Then came the barbecue, and the tray, and the handprint on my face, and there was no more room left for the benefit of the doubt. I drove home that afternoon without the radio on, glancing at my reflection in the rearview mirror at every stoplight, watching the mark on my cheek shift from white to red. My phone buzzed twice in the cup holder. I ignored it both times. By the time I reached my apartment, the anger had settled into something heavier, something closer to exhaustion. I set my keys on the counter and stood there for a long moment, staring at a photograph on my refrigerator. Me and my grandfather in his garden, maybe 6 years old, both of us squinting into the sun. I thought about every Sunday afternoon I'd spent at that kitchen table, every prescription I'd picked up, every appointment I'd driven him to while Patricia was busy with her own life. I thought about the year I'd watched her daughter 3 afternoons a week without ever taking a cent for it, because I loved being an aunt more than I cared about being compensated for my time. My phone buzzed a third time. This one I answered, mostly out of habit, without checking who it was. Before I picked up, I sat with the photograph a little longer than I probably needed to. I thought about how easy it would have been, even now, to let this go the way I'd let everything else go. To tell myself Gregory had a bad day, that Patricia was just protecting her marriage the only way she knew how, that showing up to the next family gathering with a forced smile was simpler than upending everyone's routine. That instinct was so familiar, it almost felt like comfort. I recognized it as the same instinct that had kept me quiet through years of small comments, the same one that had made me hand back a compliment about a kitchen I'd repainted myself, rather than correct the record in front of people who wouldn't have cared either way. I understood, sitting there with a bag of frozen peas slowly going warm against my cheek, that the instinct to stay quiet wasn't peace. It had never been peace. It was just a smaller, more private version of the same thing that had happened in that backyard. Me deciding over and over that my own comfort wasn't worth the disruption of naming what was actually happening. "Denise, it's Nathaniel Cross," the voice said, calm and familiar. "I wanted to check in. I heard from your Aunt Louise that something happened today." I hadn't even realized word had already started moving through the family that fast. I told him everything, the tray, the slap, Patricia's demand that I apologize, the 20 relatives who had watched and said nothing. There was a pause on the line. "Do you want me to proceed under the occupancy agreement's default provision?" I sat down at my kitchen table, the same kind of table where my grandfather had first told me about the house, and for a moment I just breathed. "Yes," I said, "please move forward." "I'll have the formal notice prepared within the week," Nathaniel said. "Given the nature of the breach, we can move quickly. Would you like witness statements included, if you can gather any?" I thought about my cousin Owen, who I'd caught staring at Gregory with an expression of pure disbelief right after the slap. I thought about my Aunt Louise, who had gone quiet and pale the moment it happened. I told Nathaniel I'd reach out. Owen texted back within the hour. "Yes, I'll write down what I saw. I should have said something today, and I didn't. I'm sorry." Louise called me directly, her voice tight. "I've been sitting here replaying it since you left," she said. "I should have walked you to your car. I should have said something to Patricia right then. Send me whatever you need me to sign." 2 more relatives came forward over the next 2 days, unprompted, once word of what had happened made its way around the family group text. By Wednesday, Nathaniel had 4 separate written statements, all describing the same sequence of events with no material contradictions. Denise brushed against Gregory accidentally. Gregory struck her. Patricia demanded an apology and told her to leave. The formal notice went out that Wednesday afternoon, addressed to both Patricia and Gregory, informing them that the occupancy agreement was terminated effective immediately due to a verified violation of its abuse and harassment provision, and that they had 5 business days to vacate the property before Nathaniel's office would pursue formal eviction proceedings, which, given that Gregory had no legal claim to the property in the first place, would move considerably faster than a typical landlord-tenant dispute. I didn't go to the house. I didn't want to watch it happen, and Nathaniel told me there was no reason I should have to. He arranged for a courier, a locksmith, and himself to arrive at the property on Thursday evening, timed for when Patricia and Gregory would be returning home from the same extended family gathering where the notice had first started circulating as a rumor nobody could quite confirm. I heard how it went secondhand. First from Owen, who happened to be pulling into his own driveway 2 houses down when the courier's car parked out front, and later in more detail from Aunt Louise, who Patricia called in tears less than an hour afterward. Gregory pulled into the driveway and saw the unfamiliar cars first, then the locksmith standing near the front steps with a toolbox, then Nathaniel in a gray suit holding a leather folder. He got out of the car laughing, according to Owen, convinced there'd been some kind of mistake, some mix-up with the wrong address. Nathaniel introduced himself and asked to confirm both their identities before he handed over the sealed envelope. "This has to be for the wrong house," Gregory said, according to Owen, still smiling. "We've lived here 2 years. Nathaniel didn't argue with him. He simply asked again for both names, wrote them down, and handed the envelope directly to Gregory once Patricia had stepped up beside him. Owen said Gregory tore it open standing right there in the driveway, still expecting it to be resolved with a phone call and an apology from whichever office had sent the wrong paperwork. Gregory tore it open standing in the driveway. The first page carried my name in bold print, identifying me as the recorded legal owner of the property pursuant to the deed executed 2 years earlier. Owen said Gregory's face changed the instant he read it, the confidence draining out of him in real time. He flipped to the second page, then the third, moving faster, like he thought speed would somehow change what the words said. "This is a mistake," he said, according to Owen, though his voice had lost most of its certainty by then. "Her grandfather left this to Patricia. Everybody knows that." Nathaniel corrected him without raising his voice. "The estate records show otherwise. I can provide certified copies of the deed, the transfer date, and Mr. Merrick's signature, if that would help." Patricia grabbed the papers out of his hands and read further, and according to Louise, that's when the second wave hit her. Not just the fact of my ownership, but the memory of every small detail she'd never questioned. The Sundays I'd spent with our grandfather that she'd assumed were just sentimental, not strategic. The private meetings he'd asked everyone else to leave the room for, which she'd assumed were about medications or insurance paperwork. None of it had ever been about hiding something from her out of spite. It had simply never been her business to know until the day it became relevant. Nathaniel walked them through the occupancy agreement's abuse provision directly, reading the relevant clause aloud so there could be no confusion about the standard being applied. He handed over copies of the 4 witness statements. Gregory reportedly grabbed his phone at that point and started calling relatives one by one, demanding they back him up, insisting the statements were exaggerated. Owen was the first call. He told Gregory calmly that he wasn't going to lie for him and hung up. Aunt Louise was next. She told him she'd watched the whole thing happen and wasn't interested in pretending otherwise. Every call went the same way. Nobody who had actually been standing in that backyard was willing to say the slap hadn't happened or that Patricia hadn't told me to leave. By the time Gregory ran out of relatives to call, the locksmith had already finished replacing the front door's cylinder. Louise said Patricia sat down on the porch steps and put her face in her hands, and that Gregory just stood in the driveway staring at a house that, legally, had never once belonged to him. He tried a different argument after that, according to what Nathaniel later told me. He claimed the occupancy agreement couldn't possibly be enforceable on such short notice, that surely there were tenant protections that gave him more time regardless of what the paperwork said. Nathaniel explained, patiently, that Gregory had never been a tenant in the legal sense. He'd been a guest under a conditional, revocable license granted by the property owner, which is a very different legal category with very different protections, and that Gregory's own signature on the original occupancy agreement 2 years earlier had acknowledged exactly that distinction in writing. Gregory apparently didn't have a response to that. He went quiet, Louise said, in a way she'd never seen from him before. Whatever performance had carried him through every family gathering for a decade simply had nothing left to work with in that driveway. Patricia called me that same night. I almost didn't pick up. When I did, her voice was already breaking before she got a full sentence out. "Denise, please," she said, "where are we supposed to go? We don't have anywhere lined up. We didn't think." "You had 5 days written into the notice," I said. "Nathaniel can walk you through temporary housing resources if you need them, but I'm not reversing this. I know you're angry about the slap, but this feels like—" "It's not about the slap alone," I said, and I meant it. "It's about you telling me to apologize to him. It's about you pointing at the driveway and telling me to leave the barbecue I decorated that morning. Grandpa built this agreement because he'd already seen who Gregory was, and I spent 2 years hoping he was wrong. I'm done hoping that." She didn't have anything to say to that. The call ended a few minutes later, quieter than it started, without either of us raising our voices again. Over the following week, Patricia and Gregory moved out under the timeline Nathaniel had laid out. I drove past the house once, on my way to somewhere else, and saw a rented moving truck backed into the driveway, Gregory carrying a dresser out to it alone, while Patricia sat on the front steps scrolling through her phone, not looking at him. I didn't stop. It wasn't my business to watch, and some part of me suspected that if I lingered, I'd end up feeling sorry for a situation that had been entirely avoidable from the very first comment Gregory ever made about my life at a dinner table. Nathaniel told me later that the handoff of keys, once the new locks were installed and the temporary access period Patricia had requested for moving purposes expired, went without incident. No confrontation, no last-minute attempt to argue the terms again. Just boxes, a truck, and 2 people quietly extracting themselves from a house that had never legally been theirs. There were no dramatic confrontations after that first night, no attempted lockouts, no further calls demanding I reconsider, no messages left on my voicemail insisting the whole thing had been a misunderstanding. Word moved through the rest of the family the way it always does, and the shape of the story changed as it moved. Relatives who had stood frozen at the barbecue started reaching out one by one, the way people do once they've had time to sit with their own silence and decide they don't like how it feels. Aunt Louise apologized for not walking me to my car that day. Owen told me he regretted not saying something the moment it happened, instead of only after the fact. A cousin I barely spoke to sent a message admitting she'd always found Gregory's jokes uncomfortable, but never once said so out loud. I accepted the apologies without turning them into a lecture. I didn't need anyone to grovel. I just wanted, finally, for the truth of what had happened to exist openly, instead of being smoothed over by a shrug and the phrase, "That's just Gregory." Gregory, for his part, mostly disappeared from family gatherings after that. Invitations grew thinner, not because anyone organized a boycott, but because people stopped extending the automatic warmth they used to give him without thinking about it. The version of him that had commanded every room simply didn't work anymore once the room had watched the consequences catch up to him in real time. Work, oddly, was where I felt the shift most clearly during those weeks. I'd spent years at the accounting firm being the person who quietly picked up whatever slack other people left behind, the one who stayed late without complaint and never asked for credit. A few weeks after the eviction notice went out, my manager asked if I wanted to take the lead on a client relationship I'd normally have deferred to a more senior colleague for, mostly because I'd always assumed that kind of visibility wasn't meant for someone like me. This time I said yes without the automatic hesitation. It went well, small thing, in the scope of everything else that was happening, but I noticed it. I noticed that the same quiet capability my grandfather had spent 15 years watching in his kitchen was still there, still mine, and that I'd simply never let it take up more room than absolutely necessary. That started to change, gradually, in ways that had nothing to do with Patricia or Gregory at all. Patricia and I didn't speak for almost 2 months. I wasn't punishing her, exactly. I think we both needed the space to figure out who we were to each other outside of the roles we'd fallen into, me as the reliable one who absorbed things quietly, her as the one who got to lean on someone else's steadiness without ever really examining it. When she finally called again, it wasn't to ask me to reverse anything. She asked if we could get coffee, just the two of us, somewhere neutral. We sat across from each other at a small place near my office, and for a long time neither of us said much of substance. We talked about our mother's upcoming knee surgery, about a coworker of Patricia's who just had twins, small safe things that let us sit in the same space without immediately touching the thing that had actually brought us there. Eventually she turned her cup slowly on the table and looked up at me. "I keep thinking about the barbecue," she said, "not just the slap, the part where I pointed at the driveway. I've replayed that so many times, trying to understand why that was my first instinct instead of checking on you, instead of asking if you were even all right." I didn't rush to reassure her. I let the silence sit there for a moment, because I think we both needed her to actually finish the thought rather than have me smooth it over the way she'd always smoothed things over for Gregory. "I think I was scared of what it would mean if I took your side," she finally said. "Not just that afternoon, every time, for years. If I admitted he was really like that, I'd have to admit I'd built a whole life around someone who was really like that. It felt easier to make you the problem." Then she told me she and Gregory had separated, not because of the house, she said, though she understood if I didn't fully believe that. She said losing the house had forced her to actually look at the last several years clearly for the first time, at how much of her life had been built around managing his moods instead of building something of her own. "I used to tell myself I was keeping the peace," she said. "I think I was just avoiding the version of myself that would have had to admit what I was seeing. I didn't have a tidy response to that. I just told her I was glad she was seeing it now and that I hoped it hadn't taken losing a house for either of us to get here, but that if it had, at least something honest had come out of it." A month after that conversation, I moved into the house myself. I hadn't originally planned to live there. For a while, I assumed I'd rent it out and let the income sit in an account, some abstract asset rather than a home. But standing in the kitchen one afternoon, looking at the counter where my grandfather used to sit sorting his mail every morning, I realized I wanted to be there, not as a landlord managing a property from a distance, but as the person he'd actually built this whole plan around protecting. I repainted the guest room he used to keep for me on the nights I stayed over as a kid, the same soft yellow it had always been, because some things didn't need changing just because ownership had. I fixed the back porch railing he'd been meaning to replace for at least 3 years before he died. I planted tomatoes in the same corner of the yard where he used to grow them, badly, every summer, insisting each year that this was finally going to be the good crop. By early fall, I hosted a small gathering in that backyard myself, nothing like the barbecue where all of this started. Just a handful of people, Owen, Aunt Louise, a couple of cousins, and Patricia, who came alone and stayed close to me most of the afternoon instead of drifting toward anyone else. Nobody performed for the room, nobody interrupted anybody mid-sentence. When Owen brought up a promotion he'd just gotten, he actually got to finish the story before anyone changed the subject. It was quiet in a way that felt earned rather than uncomfortable. The kind of quiet my grandfather used to sit in at that same table every Sunday, content simply to have people around him who weren't performing for anyone. Near sunset, Louise handed me a plate of grilled vegetables and looked around the yard for a long moment before she spoke. "Your grandfather would be proud of how you handled all this," she said. "Not the part where the locksmith showed up, the part before that. Sitting on it for 2 years, hoping you wouldn't have to use it." I thought about that for a while after she said it. I think she was right, in a way I hadn't fully considered before. The strength in what happened wasn't really the moment I picked up the phone and told Nathaniel to move forward. That part was almost mechanical once the decision was made. The real strength had been in the 2 years before that, when I had every legal right to act and chose instead to wait, to hope, to give my sister and her husband every reasonable chance to be better than my grandfather feared they'd be. I think about that folder he slid across the kitchen table more often than I expected to, now that the house belongs to me in every sense, not just the legal one. He never told me exactly what he'd seen in Gregory that convinced him to build something so deliberate, so specific. I used to think it was one bad interaction, some conversation I hadn't been present for. Now I suspect it was smaller than that, and more cumulative. The way he watched Gregory interrupt me at dinner and never once apologize for it. The way he noticed a repainted kitchen get claimed by the wrong person and nobody in the room correct it. My grandfather spent his whole life being careful and observant in ways people didn't always notice until much later, and this was simply the last and largest example of that habit, arranged quietly enough that even I didn't fully understand its shape until the day I needed it. Walking out of that first barbecue with a handprint on my face wasn't the moment I lost my family. It was the moment I finally accepted that some silence isn't peace at all. It's just quiet damage, spread out over enough years that nobody notices it accumulating until somebody finally decides to stop absorbing it. My grandfather saw that coming long before I did. He didn't build me a weapon. He built me a door, one I could choose to walk through or leave shut, and when the day finally came that I needed it, it was already there, waiting, exactly the way he'd planned it.